When in part one we left off with what is consciousness. I'm asking you because you've written a lot of books about it, and everyone is struggling to define it, and we start with the hard problem of consciousness. So take it away.
Right. Well, here it seems to me, am I, in this lovely room with a view of the river and the fields outside. I think I am conscious of it. But as soon as I say that, I've got into dualism. I've got into, I'm in here and there's a world out there. And they're separate. And this is mind and this is experience, subjective experience. But there's a real physical world. We know this doesn't work. Or at least nobody's ever made it work. It's called dualism. Many mystics, meditators and other such people, myself included, have experiences of non-duality in which that just goes away and it's quite clear that everything's one. But the weird thing is when you're in that state, well, who's in it? Because it's very, very hard to say anything more about it, and it seems that it doesn't enable you to go, now I've experienced non-duality, now I understand the neuroscience problem, I can solve the hard problem. Doesn't happen. My own view of consciousness is it's really what's wrong with all the other views, which may not get us very far. But in a way, I'm following the footsteps of people like Dan Dennett, Nick Humphrey, Michael Graziano. Well, he's more recent than me, though, but so-called illusionists, in saying that consciousness is an illusion. And many people hate that. But get over that. You get over it. What I mean by illusion is not it doesn't exist, not that there isn't a problem, but we systematically get it wrong. We systematically think that what we have to explain is something like, at least when I say we, many neuroscientists, philosophers, psychologists in consciousness studies think, not all, a lot of them think, we have to explain how the brain gives rise to consciousness. That's already dualist. There's a brain, a physical thing, and it's giving rise to this subjective thing. So that seems to be wrong. I think many of the standard descriptions, the stream of consciousness, the emergence of consciousness, the arising of consciousness, the power of consciousness, all these things come out of that deluded way of thinking about ourselves and the world. So, having said that, I therefore reject the search for the neural correlates of consciousness, because there isn't a separate thing that you can find the correlates of. I reject a whole lot of those approaches. And what am I left with? I think it gets us somewhere if we reject false views, but I do not claim to have a theory of consciousness or to have solved a hard problem. I'm sort of tempted by various types of panpsychism. That is the idea that everything's conscious anyway, but in most forms that doesn't really work. Maybe in the form that anything in the universe, whatever that is, that represents itself as separate from the universe has experience. That's what it's like to be, if you're a bacterium and you're just a single cell going, that's the outside, this is the inside, push away that chemical, go towards this, that would, to my mind, be there's something it's like for that bacterium in the same sense that it's telling itself that's what it's like. And that's all we're doing, but we're so much more complicated. We get into all this idiotic business of thinking, I'm in here, I've got free will, I've got this thing called consciousness. Let's drop that. Easier said than done. But that's about as far as I would go with where I stand on consciousness.
So there's no duality because there's not something that's separate from us. And then you look to memes as ways that we understand ourselves, but they're just stories, an illusion.
Yes, I think fundamentally our brain is telling a story about a self who is in here, looking out through the eyes and in control of the arms and legs and so on. That may be true to an extent with other species, but it would be very much simpler. Everything is changed when you have words. And, I mean, memes are any information copied from person to person. and words are obviously the absolute prime kind of memes. Our culture is very much based on language and on those word memes. So when we start as a little kid, and I gather you've got grandchildren, I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I'm sure you've had the same experience. It's amazing watching them pick up words and using them. But very, very early on, they're picking up me, I, you, I do this, you do that, I'm doing this, I am, my name is. And then as we get older, that becomes, I want this and I need this and I'm going on my holiday to wherever it is and I'm going to be an engine driver or, whatever. All these memes that we get, particularly things that we either love or hate, either grab or push away, cling to or reject, they start to build up a very complicated story, which becomes very, very hard to see through in our ordinary lives, rushing about wanting things. That's the way in which I think that the memes build up a self. The memes, they're selfish replicators like genes are, and they cling on to the self and they make the self an even more clingy thing that thinks it's so important. That's the way in which I think memes contribute to consciousness.
Is the Donald Trump baby blimp, that floated over London? Is that a meme?
Oh, yes. Absolutely, it's a brilliant meme. I mean, in a way, the perfect meme from that would be a copy of it, which I have never seen there being any copies, but there are photos of it all over the place. That's a very, very successful meme. A viral meme in internet meme terms. It's become viral, it's gone everywhere, and so it should. I think it's a very good depiction of the man who came and walked on red carpets and met the Queen.
And the taxpayers in the U.S. paid for his 4 children and their spouses to meet the Queen as well.
Oh, well, I'm jolly glad. I didn't know that the US paid for them to go. I thought we were paying it all for the red carpets and the amazing dinner and that.
I'm sure you paid for that. An
entourage of 1,000 people he had. Here's an interesting contrast, nothing to do with what we're talking about, but he comes along with an entourage of 1,000 people and all those black cars and everything or other, and has to be completely encased in bulletproof whatever. Our Queen, our dear Queen, I'm not a royalist, but she is such a wonderful woman and has done, lived all my life, basically, with her calm, sensible approach to everything. She goes around in open carriages I'm sure she's got protective people around, but she's not behind bulletproof glass. She gets out of them. She goes in the street. She shakes hands with people and says hello. She could be killed anytime. And I think she's amazing. She's not a coward hiding behind a screen all the time. Right. Sorry, I shouldn't get into international relations, should I? But you started it.
No, I totally agree. Because he's so horrendously important and powerful in things like denying climate change or, passing laws that allow people to pollute. So, he's a very powerful influence in terms of his particular consciousness.
If we're talking about memes, I think something that shocked me, and I wrote my book, The Meme Machine, just over 20 years ago, and I had kind of believed that the way that as memetic evolution speeded up, it would keep going in the ways it has. And instead what I've seen is the coming back of anti-abortion. For goodness sake, I thought the woman's right to choose over her own body would always be going forward, and instead, but in your country, it's going backward. And in many parts of the world, people think that women just are bodies to be had by men. And think about the religious right and so on. I thought we were finished with that, but oh no, it comes back, and the power of religion. In one way, it shows the power of memes. It shows the power of the kind of memes that thrive on old-fashioned genetic principles, men having power over women, particularly over reproduction, keeping control of them, powerful men stopping free speech and so on. I now have to think about memes in a much more honest way, I suppose, that the competition between freedom and openness and oppression by powerful people will probably go on as long as there are people.
Right.
But that takes us a long way from consciousness, which I think was more what you wanted to talk about.
No, I think it's an important part of consciousness, because you're saying that memes are kind of the puzzle pieces that we use to define how we think, and so they're very much a part of consciousness. But at the bottom line, does this mean that there is no duality because it's all material based?
Oh, not for me, no. I mean, materialists would say so, and I can perfectly understand that because we know an awful lot about what looks like the material base. So if I look at this pen, it looks to me, given my upbringing and everything else, to be a material object. I can drop it, I can draw with it, and so on. So I can understand being materialist, but that doesn't solve the problem, because you hit the hard problem of consciousness, you hit the problem of dualism, and that is very, very hard. It's the hard problem. Alternatively, if you say, and it drives me absolutely up the wall, if you become various types of idealist, Deepak Chopra, with whom I've had wonderful conversations, really interesting, but somebody like that, or many of these people who believe in mind beyond the brain and all this kind of stuff, they simply get the problem the other way around. If they say, consciousness first, everything's consciousness, well, why does there seem to be a material world? Why can you and I agree that we are having a Skype call and there is a computer? If it was just this experience, there wouldn't be any explanation of why you and I can agree and speak to each other. There has to be some medium but what is it? If I say it's matter, I'm stumped. If I say it's mind, I'm stumped. So that's why I would say I'm a neutral monist. I seek for non-duality somehow, and I don't know how we're going to find it. But I suspect that one day, the problems we have at the consciousness, psychological, neuroscience end of things, and the problems that the physicists have at the subatomic level problems, and the problems of not being able to bring together the fundamental theories that they have in physics at the moment, maybe they'll come together in some way and we'll solve it. But we haven't, which is why I'm not a materialist and I'm not an idealist either.
What's your label?
Neutral monist. And all that means is I'm not a dualist. It's a bit like being an atheist. I refuse to be a dualist. I refuse to be a materialist or an idealist, because they don't work. So I'm just going to say I'm some kind of monist, i.e. I think there's only one kind of stuff in the universe and we're all part of it, but I haven't a clue what it is and how it works. Wonderful way to spend a life searching to try and find out.
So it could be more than material, this monism.
Yes, but I don't know what more would mean. It could be less. It could be something other we just haven't thought of.
Okay. I'm interested in organizations that are doing this kind of skeptical research, and I think you've mentioned in your writings the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, the Skeptical Inquirer Journal, the European Skeptics Congress. Who do you look to for who's doing the cutting edge research?
Well, I don't really anymore. I mean, we're switching topic here dramatically from I'd love to talk some more about the nature of self and that story about self and so on. Maybe we can come back to that. But I no longer work in that field. I have last year been to 2 wonderful skeptics conferences, which I very much enjoyed. But when I left parapsychology, having made several attempts to stop doing it, nearly 20 years ago now, I just couldn't stand it anymore. The endless toing and froing between, here's a psychic phenomenon, oh no it isn't, oh yes it is, oh no it isn't. And so I'm really not in touch with that whole world anymore.
What
and I'm
were the
very
names?
glad not to be.
What were the names of the conferences that you went to last year?
The annual conference of the Australian Skeptics, and TAM. No, it used to be TAM, the Amazing Meeting. It's in Las Vegas. I can't remember what it's called now. It used to be James Randi's Amazing Meeting. Maybe they still call it TAM. Organised by the Committee for Inquiry. Centre for Inquiry. Centre for Inquiry, which has Skeptical Inquirer and so on. I mean, if we go back a long time, go back to the days when I was filled with enthusiasm to prove to the world the paranormal, and then started to get skeptical. In those days, the main proponents on the skeptic side was CSICOP, the Committee for the Skeptical Investigation, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. You can see how it's way back in my memory. I'm dredging these things up. I was simultaneously, I think I'm the only person ever who's been simultaneously on the board of CSICOP and on the board of the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research in London, who was all the believers in psychic phenomena. And for very, very many years, I was kind of juggling these things because I could see in so many instances both sides. And I could see horribly dogmatic people on both sides, people who just know there's life after death and they're going to force it on you, and people who just know that it's all rubbish and they're not going to even look at the evidence. And that was a lot of my life, but not anymore. I don't ever want to be doing that again. Of course there's a value in it, and I'm very glad that other people are doing it, but I did my time.
You wanted to address the story of self. Is that what you said?
Oh, yes, because we were talking about the contribution of memes to consciousness, and I brought that into the idea that it relates to the story that this body and brain are building up, the false story that there is somebody in here. And I just wanted to make the point that you can get to this from two directions. And in my life, these two directions have come together, which is wonderful, unlike what I was talking about the skeptics and the psychics. The coming together is, on the one hand, the neuroscience, which is beginning to show in enormous detail how our concept of self is constructed largely in the right temporoparietal junction with inputs from all over the place in the default mode network and so on. And so we're beginning to see how that sense of self is built up. And on the other, personal experience in meditation, in spontaneous mystical experiences and so on, which can just drop that story and either into silence or into a much more fluid sense in which self is not separate from other. So it's wonderful that these two have come together in my life. But of course, the strong implication of that is that the self is not a continuing entity. This is the way I interpret the Buddhist teachings. I'm not a Buddhist, but I practiced Zen for 40 years. The way I interpret the Buddhist teaching is what's sometimes called moment-to-moment rebirth. Reject reincarnation. There's nothing there that could be reincarnated. There's no continuous line. And the principle of anatta, which the Buddha so strenuously promoted and found people found so hard in the time of the Buddha 2,500 years ago, they found it so hard to cope with, is the self is not a permanent thing. It's not even a continuing thing. Every time we think about myself, oh, here it is. And I make this false assumption that it's the same me that was before I had to sleep a couple of hours ago, or the same me it was even a moment ago when I was making that cup of tea. That's wrong. And so if this view, coming from both neuroscience and mystical and spiritual experience, is saying selves are just ephemeral things that pop up and go away, just stories, and ever impermanent like everything else, then of course there's nothing to be reincarnated. There's nothing to survive the death of the physical body and go to wherever people believe it's going to go. You have to let go of all that craving for continuing forever, which goes along, I would say, with the false view of what we are.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Changing subject.
Okay, you say. Okay, what do you mean by okay?
I mean, I understand that you have this interesting position between dualism and materialism that's somehow undefined, but may be defined in the future as to what creates us.
What creates us? I think we have to talk in physical terms because that's what we know how to talk about. I think I have to be able to talk about brains and so on by saying I don't think materialism is true. What I mean is I don't think we can do the whole job of understanding subjective experience and objective worlds by only taking one half. That's all that I mean. But I have to talk about brains, and we do know where we come from. I mean, we know if you put a certain drug into the brain, if I had a tab of LSD now, certain things would happen, and we would be able to see in a scanner what's happening. My consciousness would be utterly transformed, possibly dropping into non-duality and out again, possibly not. But we would be able to see those things happening in a brain. We can see how the self is constructed in different parts of the brain, bringing them all together into a certain network that seems to be selfing all the time. We can understand all of those things. So I have to work with talking about a material world in order to be a scientist and to do these things, while constantly holding in my mind that the deeper down are these mysteries about the nature of experience and the world.
Absolutely. Okay. You suggested, I don't know if seriously, that people say, and perhaps you are a psi inhibitor. What's all that about?
Yeah, that goes back a long way. When I first became completely convinced of the validity of telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, all of these things, I started to do experiments, and I was absolutely, I wasn't sure I was going to get positive results, but that was what I was doing it for. That's why I gave up any chance of a sensible academic career in order to do this, prove to the world that all these academic things are, wrong and all that. And my very, very few first experiments gave positive results, but I, with help from others showing that I'd done used the wrong statistical assumptions and very, small things, but when I tidied those things up, the effects disappeared, and I never again found any results. Now, some parapsychologists, in particular a man called Rick Berger, said, well, it's because you're a psi inhibitory experimenter. Some people, go into a room and the psi's there and they'll see ghosts and they'll feel whatever it is. And other people inhibit it. And that depends on your beliefs. Well, it just doesn't add up. I mean, he wrote a paper saying that I had cheated by by changing the. I mean, we know of many cases in parapsychology, not very many, a handful of very important cases in parapsychology where people have cheated and changed the data to show psychic effects that weren't there. And he's accusing me of changing my data to pretend there weren't any effects, as though I wanted to do that. I'd given up. I'd given up a sensible PhD place at a great university in order to go off and fund myself to do a PhD because I was so committed to believing in this stuff. I mean, so it doesn't add up. So that's as far as concerns me. Does it add up in any broader sense that there could be such a thing as psi inhibitory experimenters? There was a famous experiment back in the 50s by Donald West, who is still alive in his 90s. And he and a man called West showed that there was a difference doing the same experiment. There was a difference between the results got by two experimenters. People have tried quite a few times since. In particular, Richard Wiseman has tried with Marilyn Schlitz with very iffy, tricky results. And I think what I feel about this is that never makes any progress. Parapsychology never, ever makes any progress. There's methodological progress, which has been great, much better methods. But there's no theoretical progress. If it were true that there was such a thing as a psi inhibitory or psi positive experimenter, we should be able to work out what's going on, and therefore to make experimental tests that would show us how it works. And then we'd have better theories, and then we'd do more experiments in the way that real science works. And that hasn't happened. It might, but I haven't seen it happening in 50 years.
Mm-hmm. In your book, Test Your Psychic Powers, written with your husband in 1995, what was all that about?
Oh, that was a fun book, and it's recently been put on Amazon as an ebook. I don't know if it's free. I hope it is, but if not, it's very cheap, and I just would like people to have it. Really, what that was all about was, by the time that we wrote that book, I had done so many experiments, and I was deeply involved in all sorts of psychic worlds, different worlds of psychic phenomena and claims. And I enjoy doing them. And I realised the most fundamental scientific point, which is, you don't get taught this in science, but it's true. It's doing experiments for yourself that really makes a difference. That's what pushes you forward in trying to understand any subject. It pushes you forward in your own understanding of the world and the questions you want to ask and so on. So I just wanted to make a book that would give people some very simple experiments they could do themselves. Now, we're talking in the 90s. Oh, and my husband then, Adam Hart Davis, he was then a television presenter, presenting science and history programs, but also he'd been a producer producing Arthur C. Clarke's World of Strange Powers and all of those very exciting psychic sort of programs, which I think you had in the States as well as here. So he was very familiar with that. So we got together to write a book in which each chapter would take one topic, and he'd write an amazing story that he'd come across when doing his TV programs, and I would write how to do an experiment of your own to test it. So we had things like, at that time there was a great craze of crystals, and crystals, certain type of crystals with the right vibration, would make your cut flowers last longer in a vase. So you have to do the experiment properly. And so we set up how to do it. Get, let's say, 20 little identical pots. Glasses, if you've got enough of the same glasses, or anything you've got around the house would do, as long as they're all the same, or as long as you can make two exactly the same groups. So in one group, fill them with exactly the same amount of water, pick the flowers all at the same time. One group has just water, the other group has the crystals in. Alternate them along the windowsill, mark them A and B, the one group A and one group B, same sunlight, same, whatever. And then after 2 days, get someone who doesn't know which is A and B to say which are most dead or alive or whatever. And a very simple little statistical test that we gave in the book. And we did that for ESP tests and all sorts of different things that you might do. Just simple experiments. They can be used in classes as well, but they're sort of designed to be done at home. Because my feeling was, if you really, really believe that, sharpening razor blades was another one at the time, that certain, put them in a pyramid. And so somebody's razor blades, and put half the razor and use them the same amount for shaving. Stick one group of them under the right sort of pyramid. Stick the others under a different sort of pyramid with a different shape, or a square or something else. And again, measure how sharp they are and all of that. If you do any of those experiments yourself because you really believe it's going to work, and then you see the results, that's how it gets to your heart. And goes, well, what if I'm wrong? I've spent all this money on these amazingly expensive crystals and they don't actually do it. That will impress you far more than some person like me writing an article and saying crystals don't work. That was the absolute purpose behind that book, to give people that fun and also often disappointment that you learn from.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about a more recent book, Seeing Myself, The New Science of Out-of-Body Experiences, 2017?
Well, in a way, that's kind of my great life's work, which has not been read very much or been very successful. And, people think, what's she doing writing about out-of-body experiences again after all this time? Because it was an out-of-the-body experience, as you know, that set me off on this path in the first place. And I've meandered off into consciousness and memes and all over the place ever since. What brought me back to that? Well, just to tell the story, back in 1982, my first book on OBs was published called Beyond the Body. And I did my absolute best in that book to understand how it could be possible that you could have an out-of-body experience that's so vivid. It's, as people who have near-death experiences and many other experiences say, it's more real than real. It's more vivid than anything in ordinary life. It's this incredible, it seemed, and yet the things I saw were not true when I thought honestly about it, and looked at the places the next day and so on. How can this all be true? The psychology we had back then in the late 70s and early 80s wasn't really up to explaining it. But in this century, what's happened is the advent of neuroscience and brain scans and everything else. And we now know from various brilliant experiments people have done that a certain spot in the right temporoparietal junction, if you stimulate it, it'll produce an out-of-body experience. Now that's a very, very important finding. Absolutely critical. We know the exact spot that will produce it. Now, why? See, some people will say, well, and they do. That's the spot through which that's the astral doorway. That's the part of the brain through which the astral body leaves, or whatever their theory is, or God speaks to you through that spot, or whatever it might be. It's the route to heaven. It's the way to the tunnel, or whatever. So that would be just as good if all you know is that this spot induces an OBE. You need a theory. Those kind of theories don't go any further. There's nothing you can do to test them. You can't say, right, well, if that's where the astral body leaves, then, or does it leave any traces, or does it have to have you need a theory, and it doesn't help. But amazingly now, we know what's happening there with the recent discovery of the default mode network, which is you kind of in life switch between actively concentrating on doing something and the kind of default mode where you sort of think about yourself more, and this spot is part of that. But more importantly, that spot in the brain is one of the crucial jobs that it's doing is constructing the body schema. And this is, imagine I need to be to do what I'm doing now. I need to be able to know, well, rather this body, not me, this conscious illusory self, but this body needs to keep track all the time of all of this. So do birds and cats and everything else. Any creature that moves needs constantly to have a body schema and know where its bits are and what they're doing. And that's what's happening here. So imagine you disrupt that. What's going to happen? Well, it's not going to have such a good time of constructing the body schema. It's particularly if your eyes are closed, maybe you've had an accident or something and the senses are not working, or maybe you're in deep, deep meditation or in a sensory isolation tank or something of that kind, or just on the verge of sleep when everything's changing. The brain is still trying to keep that body schema together, but it can't connect it up with what's coming in through your eyes and ears and touch and so on. So what happens? It splits. It's got a free floating. You've got a free floating body schema. The brain always has a kind of body shape. Even people born without limbs, for example, have a complete body schema in their head. It's just we're born with it. And so the brain keeps on doing that. And then you start to think and imagine moving, or you get the sensation of the tunnel because of what's happening in visual cortex. The whole thing makes sense. Wow! To me, that's why I wanted to write the book. Wow, at last, God, 50 years after, almost 50 years after I had that amazing experience, which is still so vivid in my mind, at last I can understand it. This is the difference between science making progress by asking difficult questions and devising tests of theories, and the astral projection, life beyond all of those things, endless mind, extended mind at large, all of these, they don't go anywhere. They don't lead to any new research. They don't lead to that, that's what's happening. So that's why I wrote that book, and I am very, very pleased to have written it, even if it's not taken seriously by serious scientists, so they're not interested. So fine. And all the people who believe in astral, not all, a lot of people want to stick to their views that something really has left the body, and they don't like the idea that we can explain it in terms of nothing leaving the body. And we're back to self. We're back to that whole thing about, am I something in here that is continuous and will live after death? Or am I just a story being built up? And this is yet another confirmation that it's the latter view that we have to take. When I say have to, I want my beliefs to be compatible with the best science I can find. I prefer to believe what seems to be true in terms of the evidence to what I would love to be true. And interestingly, what happens if you face up to some of these really scary thoughts? I don't really exist. I'm not in the way I thought. I'm just a story. And I'm going to stop one day. Oh, when I go to bed tonight, it'll be a different me wakes up tomorrow. These things are quite hard. But if you actually go with them, they turn out actually to be very freeing and quite different from the fear that seems to be at the outset. So that makes it actually easier, if you get in the hang of it, to go with this and to give up your prior commitments and your prior desires for there to be an important me that's in there. And in a way, I don't know why I say in a way, I am very grateful that I went through the process of having that dramatic experience, becoming a complete believer in all kinds of stuff, and then through evidence and my own experiments, finding I was wrong and having to change my mind. Because that is the central need of a scientist, is to prefer to go with the evidence than to go with what you want to be true, or with a theory that you want everyone to believe your theory is brilliant, or anything else. You have to give that up. And having been forced to do that in my early 20s, mid-20s, it's okay now. It becomes easier and easier to go, oh, I was wrong again, start again, try another line of thought, try another experiment, because that's how we learn.
If Eben Alexander was listening in on this, he'd say, oh, my brain was totally composed of pus. It disintegrated in my encephalitis, my coma, but I had all these vivid experiences. I remember them. I located my birth sister who I didn't know about in my physical life. How would you respond to his experience, his NDE?
Well, I haven't done a thorough investigation of his case, and to have any definite answer to that question, I would need to do that, as I did with cases long, long, long ago, but haven't done for a long time. But, out there in the literature are questions such as, well, was it really a coma? Was it really the infection that caused a coma? Because the doctors say, well, he was sedated. He was hallucinating and distressed and anxious, and they needed to sedate him. They gave him a cocktail of drugs, including fentanyl, which is become very famous and can produce hallucinations. So the argument is that it wasn't a natural coma induced in that way. We don't know exactly what the state of his brain was, and we also don't know just how much brain you need to produce certain experiences. If he had any of the visual cortex operating, then he will get things like tunnels and amazing lights and all of the kind of things that we know distressed visual cortex will produce. If he had any part of the temporal lobe left, then he'll be having memories and using those memories to construct things. And so much of his book it's obviously hallucinatory. The girl on the butterfly wing and all this stuff. It's really interesting. My approach in meeting these things is always to say, okay, I'll believe in as much as I can. I will assume the person is being honest about what they record of their experience, and I will believe that and listen very hard to that, but I will not believe their theories. I will have an open mind about the theories. And of course, all of these heavenly tourism genre books, they all go to a different heaven. They all, all of this kind of stuff, and they all heavily load it with their own theory, whether that's a Christian theory, which it mostly is in the American ones, or some other religious theory, or a psychic astral sort of theory. They load it with that, and that's the case with Eben Alexander's book. You can read it as a really fascinating story of hallucinating under a very difficult conditions induced by all these drugs. But he will just pick on a couple of tiny little things to say, there you are, that proves it. Well, did he really see his birth sister? Well, all we know is that he looked at a picture and went, oh, that's exactly that. We don't have a really good description from him of exactly what she looked like. And think how, if you had a dream, let's say you have a lucid dream, a really vivid lucid dream, and you meet somebody in that dream, and you see their face really, really well. Now, what are you going to say in a description that can be checked against a photograph later? Could you draw one? Most people can't draw portraits very well. Would you say, well, a long nose and brown eyes and hair this long and whatever? You could do that, but that would fit an awful lot of photos. And when it comes to seeing a photo and combining it with a memory, all sorts of eliding processes are going on. Is that sufficient to overthrow all of science as we know it, to prove that he had really gone to heaven? I wouldn't say so, would you?
Well,
do you think so?
What's interesting to me is that Robert Monroe, who was kind of a skeptic, had astral experiences. And in his books, his descriptions of the levels that he saw were very similar to even Alexander's. So the fact that people who had unrelated experiences that were similar indicates what? They had similar hallucinations, but what
yes,
were they drawing from?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. They have similar hallucinations, and these levels are fascinating. Now, if you go back in the OBE literature to the really most famous fundamental stuff early in the last century, Muldoon and Carrington. And Hereward Carrington was a very famous psychical researcher, and he was approached by Sylvan Muldoon, who said, "You're wrong, Mr. Carrington, you claim blah, 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 but I can have these experiences and I tell you you're wrong." And so they wrote 2 wonderful books and collected lots more experiences. Then we've got, even before then, we've got the spiritualists. And all of these, and the theosophists talk, which is where astral projection theory comes from, is from theosophy, from Madame Blavatsky, who travelled in India and towards the end of the 19th century and wrote all her famous books. They talk about these levels too. And this suggests to me that there is something really going on in the similarity in our brains that produces these levels. Are they true levels out there? I mean, some people call them levels 1, 2, and 3. Some others call them the hell realms, or others call them the astral, the etheric, the causal, the mental, all the different bodies which inhabit the different levels. But they're all rather similar. I mean, one of them that's fascinating, which is level 3, I think, in Ram's book, but it is one which has buildings and cities and sort of vertical structures and so on. And they tend to be described, they sound very similar, these weird kind of cities. And yet they have elements of the world that the people had lived in at the time. So the Victorian ones have slightly different kind of cities to the modern ones with more skyscrapers and so on. Nevertheless, what's interesting is you also get them. I've had that with ayahuasca, a very interesting drug indeed. And you just get these kind of these vertical things, and these things are a bit like buildings, and it's a very small step. I mean, I'm assuming that there's parts of the visual system that are devoted to detecting these things are becoming active and producing these kind of patterns, and it doesn't take very much more brain work to turn them into the kinds of cities that you have at the time. And then they have the kinds of travelling. Here's another interesting one. Muldoon and Carrington talk about the 3 travelling speeds, and I think those are very precisely the speeds in which we can move in our imagination. This is something I've written about in my book. It was fascinating to me when all my love of the astral projection theory was beginning to crumble, to see this in a slightly different way. You can move. If I ask you now to imagine wherever I think you're in your home, so let's imagine you're going to stand outside your front door. Now, you can do this by going, you just switch from one view to the other. You can do it by the slow travelling method of astral projection, where you literally imagine, you really fly through the doors and out of the door and shut the door and turn around and look at it. or you can do a sort of zoom, which you probably wouldn't do to go to your front door, but if I asked you to come here to England, you would go, and so now the three travelling speeds of astral projection just map very precisely onto how our imagination works. And, to me, the great joy, really, of the science of all this is for these things to happen, to fall into place, to go, all these amazing people who've had these incredible experiences and written them down and practiced with them and got good at it are telling us something about our minds. And when we find out how that's actually working, that's great. So these are all different ways of saying why I wrote Seeing Myself, because all those thrills of things falling into place have been fantastic.
Mm-hmm. So all the astral travel and the mystical experiences can be explained by brain functioning?
At the moment, no. At the moment, I would say out-of-body experiences. I should say for people listening, I like to stick to the definitions. An out-of-the-body experience is an experience. It's an experience in which you seem to be out of your body. If you seem to be out of your body, it's an out-of-body experience. If you use the word astral projection, you're implying that something has actually gone out of the body, and you need to find out what it is and how it's gone. So having the OBE as a neutral definition means you're not committed to a particular theory. So I'm sorry, I forgot your... yes. So I would say we can do very well at the moment in explaining the OBE, because we know where it's produced and how it's distortions of the body schema and so on. We can do very well at explaining the tunnel experience, the life review, and which you get in the near-death experience. In fact, all of those parts of the near-death experience, to a greater or lesser extent, are falling into place now. We have clues to all of them, some better than others, but it's all falling into place. When we come to mystical experiences, I think it's much harder. We do know that certain part of the temporal lobe is involved in many different types of mystical experience, but we don't have the same. There just aren't enough scientists out there who care. There are becoming more. I've had an email this morning from a friend in Germany who's beginning a big project on pure consciousness, pure silence, the going away of self into where there seems to be awareness without awareness of anything, which in some theories of consciousness is impossible, because there's only what the contents are. Now he's doing a project on that. He's among a few, I would say, great people in consciousness studies now who are actively looking into these experiences, but we don't know much yet. But how exciting that possibility is, because we now have so many tools for looking into what's happening in the brain, that I think we will understand it better. And my great hope is that will lead us towards some kind of theories which will get us to escape from duality and have some kind of non-dual theory. But we're a long way from that. So my answer to your question there is, we're really getting there, but there's a long, long way to go. As always in science, the more you learn, the more the questions open up.
Right.
The opposite to how it is with all these theories of life after death, where the more you find out, the more it closes down. Nothing ever changes. You just stick with kind of, well, that's what it is. Ooh.
What I'd like to do is go through some of the research, like the Gansfield studies and the remote viewing and the rings, but we're at 48 minutes. So how are you feeling? And should we set up another session?
If you're willing to just talk about them in maybe 10 minutes, I could probably do that. If you want more, I mean, that should surely be enough. It's all long time ago stuff. If you're willing to have a fairly short go at that, it would be nice to have this all out of the way, because I'm still ill. I'm not getting better, and it weighs on me a bit having to think about having to do things. So what do you think?
Let's give it a try. Jessica Utz, who you know, who did the statistical work for the remote viewing, said that in ESP experience, the chance will be 25 hit rate, but the average is 27. In Gansfield studies, we see more like a 33% hit rate. So across the board, the psi research gets small but statistically significant results that can't be explained by chance. So why is it that they are beyond chance?
Yeah, that's the question. Now, is it true? Now, Jessica is a serious statistician, and I cannot compete with her on statistics. But I can still try to answer your question in various ways. First of all, that 33% is very, very rare. That's not what comes up in the meta-analyses. It's often more like the 27 instead of 25. It's closer. Now, this could be a very small, difficult to find effect, as you get in many other scientific endeavours, but it never seems to get anywhere, and the theory never helps us make any progress. Why is it happening if it's not psi? Well, it can be statistical errors. It can be the file draw problem, that is, you only publish the positive results. It can be flaws in the experimental design, and it can be fraud. And all of these things have played a part. I can tell you a story that was very, very important to me at the time, and in a way still is, to do with the Ganzfeld. And remember that I've not been doing active parapsychology for more than 20 years now. So this is a story going back to 1979. And at that time, I was very much in the, I don't know, there's all this evidence, I'm sure there is psychic fraud, but maybe there aren't, that kind of state of mind. And I was doing my PhD in parapsychology, and I was doing Ganzfeld experiments because that had become the great thing in those days. And I had a friend at Cambridge University, Carl Sargent, who was doing Ganzfeld experiments and getting fantastic results. He was getting, 33% instead of 25. He was getting, marvelous things. And another friend I was in the Society for Psychical Research and very much involved in all of that. And a friend there said, there's something you're doing wrong in the experiments. Maybe it's to do with, he didn't call it a psi inhibitory experimenter, but maybe you don't have the right empathy with the people or something of that kind, or the way you're doing it is not right. And why don't you go to Carl Sargent's lab and try and learn from him how to get results? And the Society for Psychical Research gave me a small grant. In those days, I had very, very little income. Obviously, I was doing parapsychology unfunded. They gave me enough money to be able to go to Cambridge. I found a place to stay. And the plan was that I would spend a week before Christmas with Carl, looking at his experiments, learning what to do, and designing a new experiment that we would come back after Christmas. As we were talking about earlier, the comparison between psi positive and psi inhibitory experimenters, we would both do the same experiment and compare the results that we got. So I went along to his lab, and the first day was amazing. We did 3 Ganzfelds. I should say Ganzfeld is hard to do. You have to have a soundproof room with a nice comfy bed. You have to take your person in, get them all ready, put them there, lie them down, put the things over their eyes, so that's the Ganzfeld, a continuous field, have the right headphones with white noise. All of these things much harder in those days before computers, yes, before the sort of computers we have now. Then, they're in there for half an hour. Someone has gone to another room, all randomized correctly, and which picture they're looking at. Then the whole thing takes best part of 2 hours, and certainly an hour and a half to run one session. So doing 3 in a day is a full day's work. And the results were fantastic. When the person who's been in the Ganzfeld, the subject, has been lying there for half an hour and talking about what the impressions they've had, they have to look at 4 pictures, and they are then with the subject's experimenter in a room looking at the 4 pictures. Neither they nor the experimenter knows which picture was being looked at by the sender, and they sit there and talk about it and decide, pick that one, because of the similarities in what they saw. And then in comes the other experimenter and shows which picture it was. And not only did they pick the right picture, but the items that they picked up on seemed really impressive. And so I was like, wow. And I pretty quickly worked out that either, there really were only 2 possibilities. I could see how well designed the experiment looked. statistics are very straightforward in that experiment and very well known. They had got the randomization with this very complicated randomization procedure, but I thought, well, that's fine. That works. They got isolation of the subject from the experimenter in a different building. The protocol seemed absolutely fine. And I came very quickly to the conclusion that either this is psi, and I've got to go back again and give up all my skepticism, and it's really true, and I'm going, partly exciting and partly no, real turmoil, or it's fraud. Oh my God, but my dear friend Carl, he can't be cheating. That would be awful. You can imagine the state I'm in. So I decided that I'm going to do everything I can to find out what's going on. And I recorded, and I've still got all these notes, I recorded in detail everything that was going on. And I began to focus on the randomization procedure, because it had a little pile of 20 envelopes that were supposed to have 5 A's, 5 B's, 5 C's, and 5 D's. And you pick one at random, and that tells you which the sender, which picture they've got to look at, and so on. And it occurred to me that, well, when you've done that, you've only got 19 left. So if you've only got 19 left, you've got to put back in the right one that you've just taken out. So somewhere you've got to have some other little envelopes that you know what's in them. So a way of cheating would be to take, instead of taking one of these envelopes, like you're supposed to do, wherever you've got, and it turned out there were 4 drawers with A, B, C's and ready for replacement, you take one of those instead and chuck one of these away. Right? That would be a way of cheating. Well, lo and behold, a couple of days later, so what I did is I was like Sherlock Holmes, I put little hairs in the drawers to see when which drawer should be opened after the experiment's finished, not before. Put little hairs in them to see which drawers were opened. Check the dustbins to find out whether they'd thrown one away, as I would predict. Count the number of envelopes, and ultimately open the whole 20 pack to see whether it was supposed to be, or whether by this proposed cheating method it would have become unbalanced. And there was a really scary session in which Carl himself shouldn't have been involved in the randomization, but he said to the main experimenter, "Oh, I've done the randomization for you because I know you're in a hurry." And then he came into the session at the end when we were doing the judging, and so potentially he could have known, if he'd used that method, which was the right picture. And I have in my notes, Carl seems to be pushing the subject towards B, and B was the answer. And then I went and looked, and the drawers had indeed been opened as I'd predicted, and the pack, when I finally, a few days later, confronted them and we opened the pack, it was indeed unbalanced. So, in my opinion, all his results have to be rejected, because if you can show in one session that it was cheating, I think you have to reject all the data. Now, what happened next? I mean, it was the worst thing that's happened in my life. It was so awful, because I couldn't believe that somebody would do that, even though he had said to me in the past things like, it's obviously true, and a little bit of cheating here and there doesn't matter because it's obviously true. I mean, but I didn't notice those at the time, but it all came back to me. But the worst thing that has happened since, which is really, really upsetting, is the meta-analyses, where a meta-analysis is when you put together lots of similar experiments, and there have been several meta-analyses, including of the Ganzfeld experiments. And a very famous psychologist called Darrell Bem got into all this much later, and there was an early meta-analysis by Honiton and Harp back in 1985, and then Bem came on the scene much later. Carl's data all appears in that meta-analysis, and nothing is said in Bem's paper. In fact, all Carl's data are in there, and there's not even in the reference list the list of the papers from which it came, and there certainly isn't any reference to the papers that I wrote explaining what I've just told you. In other words, anyone reading these meta-analysis papers will understandably think, "Oh, wow, how could anyone not believe this?" Well, I know that they shouldn't believe it. It is appalling that this can happen, that people can so mislead the public, who really, many of whom would love this to be true, when we know it shouldn't be. What I did was I wrote to the journal in which this meta-analysis was published. And you should know one thing about meta-analysis. You have to do what's called a flaw analysis. We don't have to, but you often do. That is, you draw a graph, basically, in which you look at how many flaws you can find in the experiment, in the way it's designed, the way it's carried out, or whatever, and you relate that to the effect size. And obviously, if the more flaws there are, the bigger the effect, then the effect is due to the flaws. And a flaw analysis which shows no relationship between the number of flaws and the effect size would say, well, look, that flaws can't account for it. And they've done this analysis and said that it showed that the psi effect was genuine. And I thought, well, rather than say they must throw out all Carl Sargent's data, because I can't prove that he was cheating all the time, but I can show that the randomization procedure was faulty, because if it can be open to cheating like that, it's not a good procedure. And so if you count, so I redid the meta-analysis, the statistics, with all Sargent's data counted as flawed for randomization, and then the flaw analysis shows a positive correlation between the number of flaws and the effect size. And I sent this to the journal, and they didn't. They said they were going to publish it, and I was delighted, and I waited and waited and waited, and they never did publish it. So, now that really is all I need to tell you about my despair in parapsychology. Other people have different experiences, but my experience again and again, this is the worst example, but was again and again, oh my God, out there is all this stuff that the public reasonably think, all these books they read that are saying, look at this amazing stuff, and I'm going, yeah, but it isn't. And in the end, that's why I just haven't for 20 years wanted to be involved in this all anymore, because it is so depressing. Sorry.
Well, let's just go through a few more. Roger Nelson, the rings at Pear at Princeton, he said, we've been trying to tear it apart, but there's always a persistent small but real effect in terms of people's ability to influence the random number generators, and they can even influence it after the data's already been collected if they haven't read it.
Yeah, similar things apply. And how weird is that? There are many problems. You can analyze before and after, and how long before and how long after, and you can go on and on. It never really seems to get anywhere. Long time ago, going back to my parapsychology days, I was asked to debate with Dean Radin over one of these RNG experiments. And they sent me the data by post and sent me this wonderful graph that showed this effect. And I spent a long time poring over this and redoing the analysis and found that it didn't add up at all. Wrote back to them, physical letter, 5 days to get over to the States and back, 5 days to get there, another 5 days to get back. And they wrote back and said, oh, thank you for pointing out this mistake. Oh, yes, we'll do it again. And I'm like, oh, God. Well, they did do it again, and maybe it's fine. I don't know. I think the only answer I can give you is I don't know. And you can throw all of this stuff at me, and I don't know. I'll just say this. If there is psi, one day somebody is going to find it for real. They're going to come up with some kind of theory that enables you to do better experiments that actually push forward the theory. At the moment, there is no decent theory of psi, and the experiments just go on and on producing these tiny little effects which may or may not be psi, may or may not be errors, fishing for data, all the other things that I've mentioned.
William Benston has done these wonderful experiments with curing the mice who've been injected with lethal breast cancer cells, and he gets like 89% cure rate for the mice that are... Do you think it could be that simply that human thought, intention does have an effect? So it's nothing spooky, it's just thoughts have intention can make a difference.
It would be very spooky if it happened at a distance. If you could look at these vials and whatever. I mean, if you have an effect on mice by being with them, by the sounds you make, by the feel that you have, by the smell that you give them, whatever, fine. Let's do the science and find out. But if it's meant to be a psychic phenomenon, then it would be spooky, and we need a theory to explain it. But I very much doubt that it happens. But I hope I've given you enough of a gist of how difficult the field is, how frustrating it is that it really never makes theoretical progress of any kind, and why I don't want to mess with it anymore. I can't give definitive answers. I can only say I never found any, and I found lots of problems with other people, and the hard work it takes to investigate these things. It can often take longer and harder work to find out what went wrong with someone else's experiment than it did to do the experiment in the first place.
2 quick questions. What do you do for fun? How do you balance all this thinking?
That is so interesting. You wrote me an email, it must be some weeks ago now, even months, in which you put a few questions. And one of them was, it wasn't what do you do for fun, it was how do you find time for fun? And it's fascinating, my reaction to that. Because my first reaction was, well, I don't have fun. And then I thought, well, what is fun? And then I've been spending a lot of time thinking, well, what counts as fun? So, and people laugh at me because surely you know what fun is. And then I remembered that as an 18-year-old, I went to stay with my cousins in America, and my 15-year-old cousin Mary said, well, we just want to have fun. And I can remember saying, well, I don't like fun. I mean, God. So all this came back with when you threw that question at me. But more realistically, if I answer your second version of the question first, the things I do, I would say for pleasure, which isn't always quite the same as fun. Gardening is a huge one. We have 7 acres here, of which about 1.5 acres is gardens that I look after, which is ridiculous and too hard work, and that's probably part of why I get so bad. But I love it. I grow most of our vegetables. I mean, there are times of the year when it's very difficult, but most of the year round, I grow all our vegetables. We've got chickens and we have their eggs. We have a river running all along. Somebody else puts sheep in our field, and I spend a lot of time doing that. I go kayaking. My sister and I, not very far from the sea, and I keep a kayak down on the beach. And my sister has one too, and I go kayaking. I play in a samba band, which I absolutely love. I play a snare drum, and drumming is just great. But I think the answer to the first version of your question, how do you find time to have fun? I find time for those things, but I think the way that I do is because of all the things I don't do. I rarely go out in the evening, apart from samba practice. Very rarely. I don't go to the cinema, the theatre, to concerts. I never voluntarily listen to music. There will be people out there going, what? I really find music problematic. It overwhelms me. It makes me emotional. I love listening to wonderful music for 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'm like, I can't take any more. So I don't do that. I don't kind of have people around for dinner and go out to dinner with people. I mean, all those kinds of things that people do. I don't watch television. So I think in those ways, that's how I have time to work. Usually comes first, although I'm 67 and I keep telling myself, really, you don't have to work all the time. You've got your old age pension, But I think that's sort of an answer. But in a way, the work is fun. I mean, sometimes it's awful, and I've been going like this while you've been talking to me. Oh, okay, that's so awful. But I wouldn't keep doing it if it weren't fun to discover about the nature of the universe. And meditation isn't fun, but it's a pleasure. I wouldn't say it's fun because it's not, but it's, I meditate every day and have done for decades. And I explore different kinds of meditation when I have the chance with a different teacher. So I have plenty of pleasurable things in my life.
Are you working on a new book?
Oh, I'm ill at the moment with the chronic fatigue, as you know, and I'm thinking a lot, but I'm not actively writing. I've got a lot of thoughts about memes, about the way our culture is going, about the kind of memes that get into our heads and the good and the harm that they do, and in particular about the way I think that if you treat memes as a second replicator, genes are the first replicator, memes are the second replicator, I think we're actually in the process of letting loose a third replicator, which is all the digital stuff out there in the cloud, which I think is evolving in its own way and will result in artificial intelligence that is self-evolved, rather than the sort that we create and put in a robot or something. So I may or may not turn all these ideas into a book. But for the moment, I just spend a lot of time lying in bed gazing at the ceiling and thinking about the meaning of it all, the nature of the universe, consciousness, and memes. And that in itself is a pleasure.
The last question is, in the face of growing inequality, increasing number of autocrats, climate change, maybe 12 years to turn it around, which is unlikely, will do you consider yourself an optimist or a pessimist about our survival?
The survival of the human species, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic. I think humans will survive in one form or another. The survival of our civilization, I am very pessimistic about. I think we're heading for disaster. I just read this morning that there's unexplained increase in methane in the atmosphere. So, and because methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, that could swamp any efforts we make to reduce our carbon output. I deliberately live in the place I do years, and we've moved here more than 10 years ago, thinking, oh, I've got a river, I've got a source of water all the time. I'm going to get even better at growing veg and having the chickens and and learning how to live on the grounds that we might end up without electricity and having to fend for ourselves, and and I have all these fantasies about how this would happen, and then I get realistic and I think, look, if that happens, the people, the nasty people who were really willing to come and just steal all your food and kill you, they will do that. We don't have as many guns in our country as you have in your country. Then so many people have guns that people with guns would kill everybody else. Probably, I don't know. That I get all excited about imagining this, and I've written a little children's book which hasn't been published, but about children having fun when all the adults are dead and they're trying to survive. And when I think about realistically, I think actually it would be hell. And if I look at what we have here, I don't think, even with a reasonable group of young people to help us oldies, we could actually feed ourselves for very long and get through a winter. I just don't think we would survive. And our civilization now depends on electricity, and depends on power, and it depends more and more and more on digital infrastructure. What is money if we don't have electricity? It all disappears. How can you run a society without money? Well, gold, barter of food for, I think climate change is, thank goodness for the recent upsurge of interest, and the Swedish girl who's stood
Greta
up there.
Thunberg. We love her.
Yeah, thank you. I was struggling to find the name. Yes, yes. Good for her, because she's galvanized a lot of people. I think it's too late for us to do what we should have done 20 years ago. But good for her, at least people are waking up to it. But you started with the inequality and the autocrats and everything else. They're not going away, and they will not take kindly to a reduction in their power and their status and their standard of living. So no, why do we have to end on such a miserable note? But I'm pretty damn pessimistic. But what do you do with that pessimism? I try to keep my carbon footprint down, but here's a thought, and something like 10 years ago now, it would have been 2007, because I was so concerned about climate change, I decided to give up flying. And I actually then changed it to do one return flight a year for many reasons. And that's what I did for 5 years. I turned down so many wonderful invitations to do exciting things all over the world. And after 5 years, I thought, because I felt that if scientists like myself, who understand the problem and can read the data, if we don't make some example, then, that's appalling. We can't call ourselves scientists. We can't stand up for ourselves if we don't make an effort. And that was my effort. But after 5 years, I just thought, there's no point. There's no point in me, giving up all these opportunities, compromising my work as well as my family life and holidays and other things like that, but more importantly, the work really, because nobody else is doing it. And so I went back to flying. And that's the worst thing that I'm doing to the planet. At home, we, keep our house pretty cold. This is a cold country. We have solar panels all over the place. We have solar hot water heating. We eat very simple food, most of which we grow ourselves. But, just do what you can.
Do you eat meat?
Occasionally. I was a vegetarian for 30 years, and I gave it up not so long ago. The same sort of thought, really. But if everybody on the planet ate the amount of meat we do, which is probably once every 2-3 weeks, I might have some meat, or even less. I mean, it might go a long time not having any, and then there'll be, if I end up somewhere, it'll be a treat. It's a treat. And we have a turkey at Christmas, which is grown by a friend down the road, and that's how meat should be, to my mind, and fish should be a real treat for special occasions, because you're killing some other animal for your sake. But there's also the whole thing that dairy. I eat a lot of dairy, and people are going over to soy milk and almond milk, and almond milk takes thousands of gallons of water to produce. Thousands of liters of water to produce 1 liter of almond milk, and water is coming to be the great problem. A lot of these alternatives are damaging the environment in completely different ways. So I stick to a fairly conventional diet, lots and lots of fruit and vegetables, most from the garden, and occasional meat and fish. Yeah.
Anything else that you would like to see in this book that we haven't touched on? Well, we haven't really spoken much. We don't need to, but we haven't really spoken much about what I would call my spiritual path, my spiritual endeavors, fitting in with what we talked about, self and so on. My interpretation of spirituality is that it's nothing to do with spirits and souls and life after death and all that, which a lot of people go, oh, I'm so spiritual, I believe in all these things. It's to do with transforming the self, which really means recognizing the self as being impermanent and ephemeral. And that's the basis on which I meditate every day. A few years ago, I began learning to enter the jhanas, which are a series of increasingly deepening states of concentration, which supposedly lead to insight in a very deep and concentrated way. And I'm just fascinated by them because I want to know what's going on in the brain, and we're beginning to get some clues about that. Is that a Zen tradition, or where do the jhanas come from? They're in the early sutras, in the early Buddhist sutras, but they got forgotten later on, and very few Buddhist traditions actually advocate them. Because it seems what you're doing, according to the teacher that I began working with, Lee Brasington, he reckons that what you're doing is a self-induced dopamine rush. And what you do in the first jhana, you invoke through, you have to go through lots of processes first, but you invoke this energy that's called piti in the tradition, which is a kind of rushing, is possibly similar to the Kundalini, although we don't know for sure, but it feels pretty much like that. And you invoke this, and then you use the power of this, and it's wonderful, and it's really kind of joyful and lovely and whatever. You induce it, and then you use that to take you into different states, and it can be. I don't think for me it is, but it can be addictive. It's so exciting that people just do that rather than using it for insight. And it's been very much rejected in many Buddhist traditions, but it's fascinating to me. So that's one kind of meditation I do less often than my standard Zen, open, just sitting meditation. But that's one thread of my life which we haven't talked about, and I think that's enough said, really. The other is taking drugs. I smoke a lot of cannabis, which I find really helpful of an evening to just and might find my mind working in a different way. That's every day, almost every day, when I think deeply about questions of duality, non-duality, the nature of the universe, how can it be that we, all the things we've been talking about, that's when I think about them in a different way. And then in the daytime, like now, when I've not had any, I'm thinking in a different way, and I like the alternation. I mentioned ayahuasca earlier. I've had wonderful 2 opportunities to go on a 2-week
course, which involves 4 sessions of ayahuasca, which have been amazing. I've had DMT under other circumstances in 2 other different ways of taking it. I've had experience with the classical psychedelics, LSD, mescaline, and so on. And all these are also part of my attempts to understand this, what is this? So I think those are the other threads. And again, I think enough said about that. There's a lot more that could be said, but I just throw those in as the rest of what's important in my life.
Great. Thank you. This was great.